The moment you stop being afraid of him is the moment he loses. The boardroom on the 42nd floor overlooked downtown Manhattan, glass walls reflecting late afternoon light like a polished mirror. Daniel Brooks stood at the head of the 12-foot walnut table, cufflinks catching the sun as he clicked to the next slide of his presentation. A skyline of projections glowed behind him. Growth percentages, projected revenue, a 5-year expansion plan measured in square footage and market share. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. Around the table, investors in tailored suits skimmed printed packets, coffee steaming in porcelain cups that cost more than some people's weekly groceries. Then the door opened. It wasn't loud, just a soft hydraulic sigh. But the air shifted. Conversations thinned into silence. Daniel's hand paused mid-gesture. He didn't turn at first. He assumed it was an assistant, maybe someone from legal running late. But when the quiet stretched longer than it should have, he glanced toward the doorway, and the color drained from his face. Emily Carter stepped inside as if she had every right to be there. She wore a tailored ivory suit, the kind that didn't beg for attention but held it anyway. Her heels moved across the marble floor with unhurried precision, each step measured, calm. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't trembling. She simply existed in the room as though she had nothing to prove. Daniel's throat tightened. 3 months ago, he had watched her leave their house with 2 suitcases and a silence he mistook for weakness. He remembered the way she used to shrink at events like this, standing half a step behind him, fingers lightly wrapped around a glass of sparkling water, eyes searching for an exit. But the woman walking toward the conference table now didn't look like she was searching for anything. She looked found. A man entered behind her, tall, composed, dark navy suit cut with quiet precision. He didn't rush. He didn't scan the room for approval. He simply walked in as though gravity answered to him. A few executives straightened instinctively. One of them murmured, almost under his breath, "Mr. Hayes." Daniel heard it. The name hit like a dropped glass. Alexander Hayes, founder of Hayes Capital. Net worth whispered about in financial magazines. Numbers followed by the letter B. Daniel's company had been courting his investment for months. Daniel forced a smile, but it flickered. Emily didn't look at him. Not once. She took the empty chair beside Alexander as if it had been reserved all along. Her hands rested lightly on the table, steady, relaxed. No shaking. No clenched fists. Just composure. Alexander adjusted his cuff, glanced briefly at Daniel, and nodded for him to continue. That nod was polite, controlled, final. Daniel tried to resume his pitch, but his voice had lost its rhythm. Words that once flowed like rehearsed music now stumbled. The clicker in his hand felt heavier than it should. Emily's gaze remained forward, attentive to the screen, not to him. She wasn't here to confront him. She wasn't here to win him back. She was simply present, and that presence was louder than any accusation. Outside, traffic crawled 42 stories below, yellow taxis inching through Manhattan blocks measured in feet and minutes. Inside, time slowed to the space between Daniel's breaths. He had invited her to countless rooms only to make her feel small. Now she had entered one he needed, and she didn't need him at all. The investors exchanged glances. Alexander folded his hands, calm as a still ocean. And Daniel finally understood something he had never anticipated. She wasn't standing behind a powerful man. She was standing beside one. And for the first time since their divorce, he was the one trying to keep his balance. Daniel tried to continue, but every number on the screen now felt like it belonged to someone else. His voice, once smooth and deliberate, tightened at the edges. He spoke about projected returns over the next 5 years, about expansion into Chicago and Austin, about square footage and market positioning, yet his eyes kept drifting toward the right side of the table where Emily sat without flinching. She did not shift in her chair. She did not cross her arms. She simply listened, chin slightly lifted, as if she were evaluating a pitch from a stranger. Alexander Hayes leaned back, fingers loosely interlaced, his expression unreadable. He did not interrupt. He did not nod excessively. He allowed silence to work in his favor. When Daniel finished a slide detailing projected annual growth percentages, the room lingered in quiet. The investors waited. Alexander finally leaned forward, the faint movement enough to draw every gaze toward him. He asked a question about long-term liquidity. Strategy, his tone even, almost gentle, yet precise in a way that cut through the presentation's polish. Daniel answered quickly, too quickly, stumbling over a metric he normally recited with ease. A bead of perspiration gathered at his temple despite the cool 72-degree air conditioning. Emily's hands remained folded on the table, a thin gold bracelet resting against her wrist, catching the light each time she adjusted a document in front of her. She was not reacting to Daniel's discomfort. She was not savoring it. She simply observed. That was what unsettled him most. Months ago, she would have glanced at him for reassurance in rooms like this. She would have searched his face for cues on when to smile, when to speak, when to stay quiet. Now she did not search for anything. She did not need permission to exist in the space. Alexander asked another question, this time about risk exposure during market downturns. The words were measured, thoughtful, never hostile. Daniel cleared his throat and responded, but the authority he once carried had thinned. Around the table, two board members exchanged brief looks. One scribbled a note in the margin of his packet. Outside the glass wall, the city moved in steady rhythm, traffic lights shifting from red to green, pedestrians crossing in neat lines measured in seconds. Inside, Daniel felt time stretch. He finished speaking and looked directly at Alexander, forcing confidence back into his posture. For the first time, Alexander turned slightly toward Emily. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the gesture carried weight. He asked, Emily, what is your perspective? The room shifted again. Daniel's pulse echoed in his ears. Emily inhaled slowly, then spoke with calm clarity, her voice steady, her words thoughtful and structured. She referenced market data, competitive positioning, long-term sustainability. She did not criticize Daniel. She did not undermine him. She simply added insight, as though she had always belonged at the table. When she finished, silence settled once more, but it was no longer tense. It was contemplative. Daniel realized something he had never considered during their marriage. Her silence had never been weakness. It had been restraint. And now, seated beside a man who did not silence her, that restraint had transformed into quiet authority. The silence after Emily finished speaking did not feel heavy. It felt decisive. One of the senior partners cleared his throat softly and adjusted his glasses, reviewing the numbers she had referenced. Another investor leaned back in his chair and nodded once, almost to himself. Daniel stood at the end of the table, presentation remote resting against his palm, suddenly aware of how small the device felt. For years, he had believed he was the architect of every opportunity in their marriage. He had believed he carried the ambition, the strategy, the drive. Yet as Emily calmly answered follow-up questions about long-term positioning and regional expansion costs measured in millions of dollars, he realized she had always understood more than he allowed her to show. Alexander watched her without interruption. There was no visible pride, no exaggerated approval, just quiet acknowledgement. When she finished responding to a question about projected operating margins, Alexander gave a slight nod and turned back to the rest of the board. He spoke briefly about strategic alignment and sustainability, his tone measured, his words carrying weight without effort. The discussion shifted from whether Daniel's company deserved funding to what structural adjustments would be required before any partnership could move forward. The power in the room had rearranged itself without a single raised voice. Daniel felt it. He felt it in the way investors addressed Alexander instead of him, in the way their attention gravitated toward the right side of the table. He attempted to regain control, adding clarifications, emphasizing his leadership experience, referencing past quarterly growth percentages. But the rhythm was gone. His confidence no longer set the tempo. After nearly 90 minutes, Alexander closed his leather portfolio and stood. The movement signaled the meetings in more clearly than any formal adjournment. Chairs shifted softly against polished flooring. Papers were gathered. Handshakes were exchanged. Daniel forced composure back into his posture and extended his hand toward Alexander. Their handshake was brief, firm, professional. Then, almost as an afterthought, Daniel turned to Emily. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. He searched for resentment, for triumph, for anything that might explain how she had arrived here. What he found instead was calm. Not icy detachment. Not vengeance. Just calm. She inclined her head slightly, the same polite gesture she might offer a distant colleague. Nothing more. No accusation. No lingering attachment. The absence of emotion unsettled him more than anger ever could. As the room emptied, sunlight faded into early evening, the skyline shifting from gold to deep blue. Alexander stepped aside to allow Emily to walk ahead of him toward the elevator. It was a simple courtesy, but in that gesture was something Daniel had never mastered: respect without possession. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Emily stepped inside without looking back. Alexander followed, standing beside her rather than in front. The doors slid closed, separating the 42nd floor from the rest of the building, and Daniel remained in the boardroom, staring at the reflection of himself in the glass wall. For the first time, he understood that power was not about who spoke the loudest in the room. It was about who no longer needed to prove they belonged there. The elevator descended in silence, the faint hum of cables the only sound between them. 42 floors shrank beneath their feet, each second measured by the soft glow of changing numbers above the door. Emily kept her eyes forward, watching her reflection in the brushed steel panel. She did not look shaken. She did not look victorious. She looked steady. Alexander stood beside her with the same quiet composure he carried into the boardroom. His hands rested loosely at his sides, jacket unbuttoned, posture relaxed but alert. When the elevator reached the lobby, the doors opened to polished marble floors and late evening lights spilling through glass walls that stretched nearly 20 feet high. Manhattan moved outside in steady rhythm, taxis lining the curb, pedestrians wrapped in light coats against the cool breeze. They stepped out together. No one rushed them. No one stared. The city had its own pulse, indifferent to private revolutions. As they crossed the lobby, a receptionist greeted Alexander with professional warmth. He responded with a brief nod, nothing theatrical. The revolving doors turned slowly as they stepped onto the sidewalk. The air carried the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart, and the distant echo of a siren several blocks away. Emily inhaled deeply. It felt different from 3 months ago. 3 months earlier, she had stood on another sidewalk only 6 blocks from here, heart racing, palms unsteady, trying to make herself invisible at a crowded networking event where Daniel had introduced his new girlfriend as though Emily had never existed. She remembered the way she had stepped outside to escape the noise, the laughter that felt too sharp against her ears. She remembered the weight of humiliation pressing against her ribs. That was the night everything shifted. Tonight, however, there was no shrinking. Alexander gestured toward a black sedan waiting at the curb. He opened the rear door, not as a grand performance, but as a quiet courtesy. Emily paused before getting in, glancing up at the glass tower they had just left. 42 stories of ambition and ego reflected the fading sky. "You handled that well," Alexander said, his voice calm measured. It was not praise meant to flatter. It was acknowledgement. Emily offered a small nod. "I handled myself," she replied softly. The distinction mattered. He seemed to understand. As the car merged into traffic, the city lights flickered on one by one, storefronts glowing in warm amber tones. Inside the car, the atmosphere remained composed. No dramatic celebration. No strategic debrief. Just two people sharing the quiet aftermath of a moment that had rewritten an unspoken narrative. Emily rested her hands in her lap, noticing that they were not trembling. Months ago, after signing divorce papers at a conference table barely 6 feet long, she had sat alone in her apartment measuring out her future in uncertain steps. Rent payments, resumes, interviews, rebuilding confidence inch by inch, mile by mile. She had learned to wake without waiting for approval. She had learned that silence could be strength instead of surrender. The sedan moved south along Park Avenue, passing blocks measured in numbers she once associated with Daniel's ambitions. Tonight, those numbers felt neutral. Alexander glanced at her briefly, not searching for gratitude, not expecting explanation. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was simple, direct. Emily looked out at the blur of headlights stretching for blocks ahead and allowed herself the smallest smile. "Yes," she said, and for the first time, the word did not feel like something she was trying to convince herself to believe. The car slowed near a quiet restaurant tucked between a bookstore and a corner bakery, its windows glowing with warm amber light against the cool Manhattan evening. Alexander stepped out first and walked around the sedan, opening the door for Emily with the same unspoken courtesy he had shown all night. There was no urgency in his movements, No need to impress anyone watching. Inside, the restaurant hummed with low conversation and the soft clink of glassware. A hostess greeted Alexander by name, leading them to a table near a window that overlooked the avenue. The table was set simply, white linen, polished silver, a single candle steady in its glass holder. Emily removed her jacket and folded it neatly over the back of her chair. She felt composed, aware of her breathing, aware of the steady rhythm of the city outside. Alexander did not launch into business talk. He did not revisit the boardroom scene. Instead, he asked about her week, about the consulting project she had mentioned in passing during an earlier conversation. She spoke about market research, about building something on her own terms, about working late at her small apartment dining table that measured barely 5 feet across, but felt like a command center of possibility. He listened without interrupting. He asked thoughtful questions, not to test her, but to understand her. When the waiter poured water into crystal glasses, Emily noticed her reflection again, calmer than she had seen it in years. "You did not need to speak for me today," she said gently. Alexander considered that. "I did not," he replied. "You did not need me to." The statement was simple, but it settled somewhere deep. Months ago, she had believed survival meant attaching herself to someone stronger. Tonight, strength felt internal, steady, measured in quiet confidence rather than raised voices. Dinner arrived, grilled salmon for her, a fillet for him, portions modest but prepared with care. They ate slowly, conversation unfolding without pressure. At one point, Alexander shared a story about building his first investment firm from a rented office no larger than 600 square feet, a space with outdated carpet and flickering fluorescent lights. He spoke about rejection, about learning to sit in rooms where no one expected him to succeed. Emily listened, realizing that power did not always begin polished. It often began uncertain. Outside, traffic moved in steady lines of red and white lights stretching for blocks. Inside, the candle between them burned without wavering. She thought about the woman she had been 3 months earlier, standing outside a crowded event hall, heart pounding, pretending to be invisible. That night, she had reached for a stranger simply to escape humiliation. She had not known his name. She had not known his status. She had only known she refused to feel small again. Now, seated across from him in a quiet Manhattan restaurant, she understood something else. She had not been rescued. She had chosen. And the choice to stand beside someone who respected her voice felt entirely different from clinging to someone who silenced it. When dinner ended, Alexander did not rush the check. He allowed the evening to settle naturally. As they stepped back onto the sidewalk, the night air carried a crispness that hinted at early fall. Emily wrapped her coat around herself, not from cold, but from awareness. She was no longer stepping into rooms hoping to be accepted. She was walking into them knowing she belonged. The night air lingered cool against Emily's skin as they walked the short distance toward the waiting car, city lights reflecting in the glass towers that framed the avenue. She did not feel rushed. She did not feel swept into something she did not understand. The evening had unfolded without spectacle, without promises spoken too soon. Alexander opened the car door again, and this time she noticed the detail in the gesture, not as obligation but as consistency. Inside the quiet interior, the city became a muted blur of headlights stretching for blocks ahead. They drove north, passing intersections measured in familiar numbers, 57th Street, 63rd, 68th, each one a marker of how far she had traveled, not just across Manhattan, but within herself. After a few minutes, Alexander spoke, his voice calm against the low hum of the engine. "There is a charity gala next month," he said. "It supports small business grants for women starting over." He did not look at her immediately. He watched the road, giving her space. "I would like you to attend with me. Not as a favor. Not as a statement. Simply because I think you would appreciate what it represents." Emily considered the invitation. A month ago, the idea of standing in a ballroom filled with investors and cameras would have tightened her chest. She remembered the last gala she attended with Daniel, how she had stood beside him while he introduced her as an afterthought, how she had smiled on cue while conversations moved around her. Tonight felt different. The difference was not the location. It was the foundation. "I would like that," she answered, her voice steady. The car slowed as they approached her apartment building, a modest brownstone with 6 units, and a narrow stoop lit by a single overhead lamp. It was not a penthouse. It did not overlook the skyline, but it was hers. Alexander stepped out first, walking her to the base of the stairs. The street was quiet now, traffic thinner, the city settling into its late evening rhythm. For a moment, they stood facing each other beneath the soft yellow light. There was no dramatic music, no sweeping declarations. Just the quiet awareness of two adults choosing something unforced. "You do not owe me anything," he said gently. "Not your past, not your future." Emily met his gaze. Months ago, those words would have sounded distant, impossible. Now they felt grounding. "I know," she replied. And she did. She climbed the narrow steps, unlocked her door, and paused before stepping inside. From the sidewalk, Alexander gave a small nod, then turned back toward the waiting car. She watched him leave, not with fear of losing him, but with the calm understanding that whatever unfolded next would not be built on escape. Inside her apartment, she set her keys on the small wooden console by the door and leaned briefly against it. The space was quiet, measuring no more than 700 square feet, yet it felt expansive. She walked to the window overlooking the street and looked down at the fading taillights merging into traffic. 3 months earlier, she had wrapped her arms around a stranger simply to avoid humiliation. Tonight, she stood alone in her own home, not hiding from anything. The upcoming gala was not about proving something to Daniel. It was not about being seen. It was about stepping fully into rooms without shrinking. And as she turned off the lamp and let the city glow through the window, she realized the most powerful shift had already happened. She no longer feared running into her past. She was too focused on walking forward. 1 month later, the ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that hung nearly 30 feet above the polished marble floor. Round tables draped in white linen filled the space, each centerpiece arranged with pale roses and soft candlelight. A string quartet played near the stage, their music weaving gently through conversations measured in quiet laughter and the soft clink of champagne glasses. Emily stood in front of her bedroom mirror earlier that evening, fastening a pair of understated pearl earrings, studying the woman reflected back at her. She had chosen a midnight blue gown, tailored cleanly, elegant without demanding attention. The fabric rested smoothly against her shoulders, structured but unrestrictive. She did not dress to impress anyone. She dressed to feel aligned with herself. Now, stepping into the ballroom beside Alexander, she felt the familiar hum of a high-profile event, but it no longer tightened her chest. Cameras flashed near the entrance, capturing donors and executives as they arrived. Alexander offered his arm, not possessively, but in quiet partnership. She accepted, her posture upright, her steps unhurried across the gleaming floor. Conversations paused briefly as they passed, not because of spectacle, but because presence naturally draws attention when it carries confidence. Near the center of the room, a large screen displayed the evening's mission, funding grants for women rebuilding businesses after personal setbacks. Emily read the words carefully, feeling their weight. This was not a stage for revenge. It was a platform for renewal. As they greeted board members and philanthropists, Emily spoke easily about entrepreneurship, about resilience measured in long nights and early mornings. Her voice carried without strain. She did not glance over her shoulder. She did not scan the room for ghosts. Yet fate has a way of aligning intersections without warning. Across the ballroom, near a display of silent auction items, Daniel stood in a charcoal suit, speaking animatedly to a potential partner. He had not expected to see her here. The moment his eyes landed on Emily, his expression shifted. Surprise first, then calculation, then something quieter. Emily noticed him only because the conversation in front of her paused slightly, a subtle ripple in the atmosphere. She turned her head slowly, following the line of sight, and saw him. The distance between them measured perhaps 40 feet, but the years between them felt greater. For a brief second, old reflexes stirred, the memory of shrinking, of adjusting herself to fit his expectations. But the feeling passed as quickly as it came. She was not the woman who once avoided rooms he occupied. Alexander felt the change in her posture, subtle but real. He did not tighten his grip. He did not ask questions. He simply remained beside her, steady as ever. Daniel excused himself from his conversation and began walking toward them, each step measured, controlled. The quartet continued to play, the melody rising gently beneath. The hum of voices. Emily inhaled once, deeply, and lifted her chin just slightly. The past was crossing the ballroom. And this time, she was not the one retreating. Daniel stopped a few feet away from them, close enough for polite conversation, far enough to pretend the distance was intentional. The chandelier light caught the edge of his cufflinks as he adjusted his jacket, the same subtle gesture he used to make before stepping into negotiations. "Emily," he said, her name measured, almost rehearsed. It had been months since he had spoken it without ownership attached. She turned fully toward him, shoulders relaxed, expression neutral but not cold. "Daniel," she replied, her tone even, neither warm nor distant. Just steady. For a brief moment, the surrounding noise seemed to dim, though the quartet continued its soft melody, and waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne. Daniel glanced at Alexander, recognition flickering across his face. "Mr. Hayes," he added quickly, offering his hand. Alexander accepted it with calm professionalism, his grip firm, his posture unchanged. There was no tension in his expression, no display of dominance. Power did not need to announce itself. "I did not realize you two knew each other," Daniel continued, attempting lightness. Emily felt the familiar rhythm of his voice, the way he shaped conversations to regain control. But she no longer leaned into that rhythm. "We met some time ago," she answered simply. No explanation, no elaboration. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was deliberate. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "You look well," he said, scanning her appearance as if searching for signs of fragility he once expected to find. Emily offered a small nod. "I am well." The words did not carry subtext. They carried truth. Around them, guests resumed their conversations, but a subtle awareness lingered. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, perhaps expecting more, perhaps waiting for her to ask about his life, his projects, the details he once used to measure success. She did not ask. She did not need to. Alexander placed his hand lightly at the center of her back, a quiet gesture of presence, not possession. It was enough. Daniel noticed. The realization moved across his face slowly, like a cloud passing over sunlight. He had once believed she would always orbit his world. Now she stood in her own. A voice from the stage invited guests to take their seats for the evening program. The spell of the encounter thinned. Emily inclined her head politely. "Enjoy the event," she said. Nothing more. No lingering glance. She turned with Alexander toward their table, her steps measured, composed. Behind her, Daniel remained standing for a second longer than necessary, watching as she walked away without hesitation. And in that quiet departure, the balance between them shifted for good. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as guests settled into their seats, the soft glow from the chandeliers casting a warm sheen across glassware and polished silver. Emily sat beside Alexander at a round table near the front, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the linen cloth. The stage illuminated in gentle gold as the host stepped forward to speak about opportunity, about second chances measured not in sympathy, but in support. Applause rose and fell in steady waves. Emily listened, not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who understood every word. Across the room, Daniel took his seat at a table several rows back. He could see her profile clearly from where he sat. The curve of her posture was no longer tentative. It was grounded. When the keynote speaker shared stories of women rebuilding companies from apartments no larger than 800 square feet, of late nights spent balancing invoices at kitchen counters, Emily felt a quiet recognition. She had lived that. Not in headlines, not on stages, but in silence. Alexander leaned slightly toward her as the crowd applauded a particularly moving story. "You should apply for the grant next year," he said softly, not as a command, but as belief. She glanced at him, surprised not by the suggestion, but by the certainty in his tone. "I am not sure I need it," she replied thoughtfully. He smiled faintly. "That is exactly why you might deserve it." The program continued, and eventually donors were invited to contribute. Alexander raised his paddle without hesitation when the auctioneer announced a matching initiative for women launching new ventures. The room responded with enthusiasm. Numbers climbed rapidly, measured in thousands, then tens of thousands of dollars. Emily watched, not dazzled by the amounts, but moved by the collective intent. She felt something settle within her, a final piece clicking into place. This night was never about Daniel seeing her transformed. It was about her, recognizing that she had already transformed. When the event concluded, guests stood and conversations resumed, lighter now, celebratory. As Emily and Alexander made their way toward the exit, she sensed Daniel watching from across the room. She did not search for him. She did not avoid him. She simply walked forward. At the entrance, cool night air greeted them once more, crisp and steady. The city stretched ahead in illuminated blocks, alive and indifferent. Alexander opened the car door, but before stepping in, Emily paused for a moment, looking out at the skyline. She was not walking away from her past. She was walking beyond it. And somewhere behind her, in a ballroom filled with applause, a man who once believed he defined her worth finally understood that he never had. The car merged into the late-night traffic, headlights stretching in clean white lines down the avenue. Inside the quiet cabin, the hum of the engine was steady, almost meditative. Emily rested her head lightly against the seat, watching the city move past in reflections of glass and steel. The gala's applause still echoed faintly in her memory, but it no longer felt loud. It felt resolved. Alexander sat beside her, scrolling briefly through a few messages before setting his phone aside. He did not dissect the evening. He did not mention Daniel. Instead, he asked, "What did you think of the program?" His tone carried genuine curiosity. Emily considered the question carefully. "It reminded me that rebuilding is not dramatic," she said. "It is consistent. Quiet. Most people do not see the work behind it." Alexander nodded slightly. "The work is what matters," he replied. The car slowed near her brownstone once more, the familiar overhead lamp casting a soft circle of light on the sidewalk. This time, when she stepped out, the night felt different from the one weeks ago. Not because of who stood beside her, but because of who she had become. She turned to him before climbing the steps. "Thank you," she said. The words were not for the gala, not for the boardroom, not even for the invitation. They were for the steady presence that never tried to overshadow her voice. He gave a small smile. "You never needed saving," he answered gently. "You only needed space." She absorbed that quietly. Inside her apartment, she removed her heels and placed them neatly by the door. The silence of the room felt welcoming, not lonely. She walked to the window again, looking out over the quiet street. Somewhere across the city, Daniel was likely replaying the evening in his mind, measuring it against old assumptions. But Emily no longer felt the urge to anticipate his thoughts. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at her small dining table, the same 5-foot surface where she had once mapped out her new beginning. A notebook rested there, pages filled with plans for expanding her consulting work into a full-service firm. She opened it and added a new line under the heading for the next quarter. Not because she needed to prove anything, because growth had become natural. Outside, the city continued without pause, traffic lights shifting from red to green in steady rhythm. Emily closed the notebook and allowed herself a slow breath. The night had not been about confrontation. It had been confirmation. She had stepped into a room where she once felt diminished and left it untouched. And as she turned off the lamp and prepared for sleep, she understood that the most powerful victories rarely echo. They settle quietly, deep within, and stay. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Emily's apartment, casting soft stripes across the hardwood floor. The city outside had already resumed its weekday rhythm, delivery trucks double-parked along the curb, footsteps measured in hurried strides, coffee cups carried in gloved hands. Emily stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a mug of black coffee, her mind steady rather than racing. The gala felt distant now, not because it lacked importance, but because it no longer defined her present. She opened her laptop at the small dining table and reviewed emails that had arrived overnight. 2 inquiries from potential clients referenced her recent market analysis presentation. One mentioned hearing her speak at the charity event. She paused at that line, reading it again. Her voice had traveled further than she realized. Across town, Daniel sat alone in his corner office, sunlight reflecting off the glass walls that once made him feel untouchable. The previous night replayed in fragments. Emily walking away without hesitation. The ease in her posture. The absence of accusation. He had expected confrontation someday, perhaps a sharp exchange that would confirm old narratives. Instead, he was left with quiet clarity. He glanced at a framed award on his shelf, once a symbol of achievement. Today it felt less certain. Back in her apartment, Emily drafted a response to the new inquiries, her tone professional, confident, measured. She outlined her consulting framework, her strategic approach, her availability for a preliminary meeting. There was no urgency in her movements. Growth did not require rush. As she typed, her phone vibrated softly with a message from Alexander. A simple line, "I hope today feels light." She smiled faintly and replied, "It does." The exchange was brief, unburdened by expectation. She finished her coffee, slipped on a tailored blazer, and prepared to step out into the morning. The sidewalk greeted her with cool air and steady motion. She walked past the corner bakery, past the bookstore, moving with purpose but not pressure. Each step felt grounded. Months ago, she had measured her days by what she had lost. Now she measured them by what she was building. Across the city, Daniel stared out at the skyline he once believed he controlled, realizing control had never been the same as connection. Emily, meanwhile, did not look back at any skyline for validation. She crossed the street as the signal turned green, sunlight catching the edge of her hair, and continued forward. Not to prove a point, not to win a comparison, simply because forward was where her life was unfolding. 6 months later, the office space Emily leased on the 3rd floor of a renovated brick building measured just under 1,000 square feet, but to her it felt expansive. Exposed beams lined the ceiling, afternoon light spilling through tall industrial windows that overlooked a row of maple trees turning gold in early fall. A small brass plaque beside the glass door read Carter Strategic Consulting. She had chosen the name carefully, not hidden behind anyone else's. Not attached to a past she had outgrown, simply her own. Inside, 2 desks faced each other, one occupied by a young analyst reviewing spreadsheets, the other by Emily, sleeves rolled neatly to her forearms as she discussed quarterly projections with a client over speakerphone. Her voice was calm, assured, precise. When the call ended, she leaned back slightly, allowing herself a quiet breath of satisfaction. Growth had not arrived overnight. It had accumulated in early mornings, in disciplined planning, in resilience that no one applauded. A soft knock sounded. At the glass door, Alexander stepped inside, carrying a small bouquet of white lilies wrapped in simple paper. He did not interrupt her rhythm. He waited until she looked up and smiled. "I was in the neighborhood," he said lightly. It was not entirely true, but neither was it an exaggeration. He enjoyed watching her build something that belonged solely to her. She stood and accepted the flowers, placing them in a clear vase near the window where sunlight could reach them. There was no grand declaration between them, no dramatic shift. Their connection had grown the same way her business had grown, steady, intentional, rooted in respect. Later that afternoon, as she walked him to the door, she noticed across the street a familiar black sedan paused briefly at a red light. Daniel sat in the driver's seat, hands resting on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. For a fraction of a second, their gazes met through layers of glass and distance. He saw the sign on her door. He saw the quiet confidence in her stance. There was no bitterness in her expression, no need for acknowledgement. The light turned green. His car moved forward, merging into traffic without a wave, without a word. Emily did not linger at the window. She turned back into her office, closing the door gently behind her. The space hummed with possibility, with plans measured in months and years rather than memories. As evening approached and sunlight softened against the brick walls, she reviewed her calendar for the next week, filled with meetings, strategy sessions, and opportunities she had created with her own hands. She did not win anyone back. She did not need to. She had rebuilt her world in square feet, in contracts signed, in steady partnership built on equality. And as the lights flickered on inside her office, warm against the fading sky, it was clear that the most powerful transformation had never been about who she embraced that night months ago. It was about the moment she stopped shrinking and began to stand in her own light.